Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this month's iteration of SureCloud Cyber Threat Briefing. As usual, I'm joined by Hugh, one of our senior consultants in our cyber practice. Today, we're going to be talking about enterprise security architecture. Quite an interesting subject to me personally. My team deliver quite a lot of consultancy in this space. And Hugh, obviously, you work on the opposite side of this. So tell me your thoughts around security architecture. What does it mean to organizations? And ultimately, where do we start?
We have significant sound issues, do we? Can anyone else tell us if we've got any sound issues before we crack on?
I think I'm okay.
No? Okay. Brilliant. We'll crack on then. Yeah, so security architecture then it's a huge topic, right, across the enterprise. And I think the way that we approach it from an attacking perspective really should dictate the way that you approach it from the defensive side. So, as the attack surface across an enterprise is so huge in comparison to a typical sort of small isolated network, you've really got to consider the multitude of different paths and entry methods that an attacker might take. And so something like threat modeling, where you're considering, okay, what is an attacker going to be looking for? What are the steps they're going to try to take to get there? I think is really important when you're sort of at the initial stage of designing this enterprise architecture, to consider what's going on, and that using that information to sort of help you plan the defenses, the controls you're going to put in place.
Yeah, so it's interesting, really, isn't it? I mean, organizations look sometimes in isolation at how they're securing different parts of the enterprise. But when we're talking about the architecture as a whole, I guess what we're looking at is that entirety of the attack surface, and really trying to understand, where we are susceptible to external threats or potentially internal threats. And I guess the general feeling here, Hugh, is that we're developing this kind of defense in depth model, quite a keyword term that gets thrown around quite a lot. But what does that actually mean in practice when we're thinking about the controls and how we structure or how we create this enterprise architecture?
Yeah, so defense in depth is really important. And I think a lot of some of the mistakes that people make are they will invest heavily in a control set, and they will rely on that one control set to keep them secure. So they might say, for example, take a web application, looking at something like SQL injection as a really basic common attack. They will invest heavily in their input sanitization and filtering to make sure that no malicious content gets through that filter. But you've got to assume it will, right? You say, what if it does? This control that we've invested so heavily in, it fails us. What then? Well, you don't want that to be your only control. So you might add in secondary controls, right? So like a web application firewall. So for instance, if it doesn't successfully strip out that content, then the firewall is then able to identify that the attack has been attempted and block it there. So you're adding these multiple levels. Further along the attack chain you go, so you'll look and say, this is what an attacker is likely to do first. Okay, let's put in one control to prevent that happening. Then an attacker from there is likely to try and pivot to this location. Let's implement a control here to stop that. So you're basically getting ahead of the attacker in every move they're making and implementing a different unique control at each point in that chain.
So this layering model then is hugely important, really, isn't it? Making sure that we're, protecting ourselves around different security threats, but in different ways as well. I guess we're looking at how, our understanding of the threat actor itself and how they're likely to compromise our environment. But then, as you've just said, assuming, I guess, that each of those is going to fail, down to, obviously the areas that we're looking to protect that may have kind of that more sensitive information. So you mentioned a term there around threat modeling. So we've got this concept of threat-centric focus when we're looking at designing enterprise security architectures. Why is that really important to you? Why would we focus on the threats to us first? I know it sounds quite obvious, but a lot of organizations will maybe go with a control-led approach first. Why would we choose a threat-led approach?
So I guess in a world where budget is infinite and time is infinite, that's a reasonable approach. But I think most organizations, that's not the case, right? And so you really need to be considering what is an attacker likely to be doing and what is an attacker likely to be, trying to achieve, and focusing your risk management controls around those areas so that you're putting the most effort in where it's going to pay off the most, rather than just investing in a particular topic or a software solution or control which you think is fantastic, which ticks every box, but it's not securing the ingress method that an attacker is actually going to be trying to attack.
Okay, and as with everything in security, I guess this is an iterative cycle, right, where we're continually learning. So what about some of the new things, using threat intelligence feeds, looking at continuous testing, how do those affect our decisions in how we structure and manage our enterprise architecture?
Yeah, so I think it is, like you say, it's really important to get the basics done right at the start of any process when you're developing this enterprise architecture. But as you mentioned, it is key that you are constantly reassessing that threat landscape, because a control that you've implemented a year, 2 years ago might not be sufficient today. And so, yeah, as you say, it really is an iterative process where you're constantly establishing what the landscape looks like at the moment and what you need right now to ensure your ongoing security.
So I guess I always work well with examples, Hugh. So, I mean, obviously we've talked about this layered approach. We've talked about understanding the threats, and obviously enterprise architecture is a big thing for organizations, whether they're sort of protecting very small infrastructures and business processes, or whether they're obviously very vast. So what kind of an example could you give that I guess would help us to understand how that architecture can be affected by different decisions that we make?
Yeah, so an example I really like is the example of the front door of a house, right? So some organizations that aren't necessarily considering the defense in depth model, they'll look at a specific group of controls. So say a padlock on the front door. Now they might think, okay, what's more secure than one padlock? Let's use 6 different padlocks, right? But if all of these padlocks from the same manufacturer of exactly the same type, yes, if an attacker is able to pick one lock, it will take them more time to pick the other 5, but there's nothing materially different about those additional padlocks that means that that attack is going to be prevented. Whereas a defense in depth approach would layer these controls on. So you might have, a couple of locks on the outside of the door. You might secure the door from the inside. You'd use different mechanisms from different manufacturers, so that there's material differences in each of these controls, and they would need to be overcome or bypassed in an attack sense in different ways.
Okay, so if we think about that from a kind of threat perspective, then, so whilst we're looking at the front door in isolation, I guess what we're saying now is that the controls need to be layered in such a way that they work together to prevent that threat, rather than just layering additional controls on top of each other that may prevent the same attack path, but maybe in multiple areas. So where would we look, I guess, from understanding this information? I mean, obviously we want to get to a point where we've got an effective measurement of how this is performing. So if we're understanding our threats and we're looking at this layered control model, how ultimately do we build something that's effective and has controls that work together in such a way that we prevent those threats from coming further than we want them to?
It's a difficult question, right? How do we know it's working? I think there's various things that we can do. We can look at our traditional testing methods, seeing how many incidents or breaches that get reported, service desk tickets, that sort of thing. How successful potential, if you're having any penetration testing or red teaming done, how successful these exercises are, and how far through to the crown jewels of the organization they're able to penetrate. And I think that's probably a really good way of determining really whether your approach is working.
Yeah. So thinking about some of these attack vectors then, so obviously, the ones that we traditionally talk about, phishing, maybe not so common these days, but things like USB drops and, downloading things from the internet. And obviously, Microsoft talked, recently about, blocking macros within Office files by default. Thinking about those layered security controls, how are people going to need to think differently about their security controls? And I guess before I get you to answer that, Hugh, we've got a poll question which looks quite specifically about how you all think that attack paths will change as a result of that sort of information provided by Microsoft. So I'm going to put it up now and see what you all think. But Hugh, what do you think? How do you think it's going to change an organization's view of how they secure against simple things like macro-enabled documents?
Yeah, so it's obviously a great step that Microsoft are taking, because I think realistically these days, the number of people that need to execute macro-enabled documents from the internet is probably quite slim in comparison to the amount of attackers that are using that. But I think, again, this is one single control, right? And it's reflective of that defense in depth requirement, because yes, an attacker no longer able to send you that macro document. But then, okay, they might then know for a credential capture method where they don't need to deliver that malware onto your system. They're just going to offer you a gift card, say that you've got to sign in on some website, and then you're going to go to them and type in your credentials and they'll get in that way. So yeah, it's important to remember, I think, that these attackers, they're not just using this one method and relying on that. They've probably got many methods, and they're just going to be going for the easiest one that's available to them at that time. And so when a change comes in like this from Microsoft, we do have to think, okay, now that this isn't going to work, what is the new threat going to be?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is quite pertinent to an enterprise architecture, really, isn't it? Because you're thinking constantly about things that are changing in the environment and things that are within and outside of your control. So how might we vary our testing techniques for each of these different layers? I mean, are we? You mentioned earlier around budget. I mean, obviously, there aren't infinite security budgets these days, and if you've got one, then congratulations. But I think how can we make this as meaningful as possible? How do we focus in the right areas? We talked about threat modeling. How do we test these controls to get assurance that those layers, those individual controls that are layered on top of each other? How do we get a measurement of the effectiveness, outside of the tickets and the overall reduction in security? How can we test that?
Yeah, so I think it's really important here, because everyone knows, right? You can't test everything with fully manual testing across an enterprise. It's just resource prohibitive. But that's where our threat modeling, our threat intelligence really comes in to great value. We can identify, the crown jewels within our organization, and that's where we're going to prioritize our manual testing. Across the whole perimeter, we could probably say we can get vulnerability scanning done. That's largely automated, a light touch of human input into that, but it can mainly be done, through automated scanning tools. And that's going to give you that wide coverage over your perimeter. And then, the more critical systems, we can still focus our efforts on that manual testing. And then, after we've tested this system in isolation through a pen test, this environment's been tested with a pen test, we also then want to consider, bringing in the organization as a whole and looking at sort of a red team exercise, and can we, migrate from here to here and compromise the estate as a whole?
Yeah, okay. So it's important that we obviously design the right security testing to get the right level of assurance for the right controls. What about the processes then that sit around this, Hugh? Because obviously the architecture is not going to run itself. It's not going to sit there, with a nice fully automated process that keeps it relevant and keeps us secure. So what about some of the other things like configuration management and change management? And how do those processes affect our ability to maintain that security posture?
Yeah, I think across the enterprise, that's probably one of the largest risk areas, and where these issues creep in. Enterprise could be thousands of devices, right? It's going to be really hard to sort of micromanage each of these. And so I think that's where good documentation, good policy is really important, because remember, you've got to secure your entire estate. An attacker is only looking for one vulnerability to get in. And so, some of the most common things are unpatched systems, right? So making sure that from the start, or if I see we've got a question about, we've already got our network, we can't redo everything. Um, you can still take these steps, right? You can still try and work out, your current assets, what the environment looks like at the moment, and you can go from there.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of organisations that have maybe grown fairly quickly, or maybe fairly organically, but in a way that's not necessarily conducive to this joined up approach. So I think it's a good question. I don't think anybody's ever suggesting that we rebuild everything, otherwise we'd be forever doing it. I think for newer environments where organizations are looking at deploying things, infrastructure as code into cloud-based environments, it probably does lend itself to make significant changes in a slightly less intrusive way. But I think some of the fundamentals here, Hugh's mentioned this cost benefit piece earlier, the weighting between understanding the offensive versus the defensive. We've just mentioned about the process side of it. I think all of those things help to structure that security architecture, and improve that over time. It doesn't necessarily need us to go and make whole scale changes. But I mean, some of the fundamental things, Hugh, when you were talking about testing, I assume, these controls, we're thinking about segmentation, we're thinking about, least privilege, zero trust is obviously, a nice buzzword at the moment. What are some of the other things that organizations could be doing around existing infrastructure that, in order to maybe chip away at some of these things over time?
Yeah, so I think as I said, some of the largest risks and some of the biggest areas that we're seeing that organizations need to really improve is around like default configurations of devices, especially in the last few years where pieces of infrastructure have rapidly been deployed to sort of facilitate, remote working and new offices and things like that. We're seeing a lot of devices that are spun up, they're left in default settings with default credentials, and that's really valuable for an attacker. So I think, again, it goes back to that documentation, that understanding what you've got, how things are set up. I think, even right from the start, right, say you were designing a new environment, I think it's really important that right from day one, you're anticipating the lifespan of that system and looking at, okay, what are we going to do when it's going to be decommissioned in 3-5 years time, maybe longer? You need to have that plan from the start for the future, and that'll help you keep on top of all these changes and make sure that things don't manage to slip through the cracks. Yeah,
absolutely. So we've had another question around sort of whether there are many organizations that manage to get this right consistently. And again, we have mentioned security teams and resources and things, and it is a constrained area most of the time. But thinking about how many people get this right constantly, I mean, have you got any examples, Hugh, where people maybe have good, solid, robust security architectures and still manage to be compromised through different test techniques?
Yeah, no specific examples, but it absolutely happens, right? I'm going to say nobody has this perfect. It is a huge task, a very difficult task, and I'd be surprised if anyone gets their enterprise architecture bang on. I think but it's not a binary system, right? We're not either making no efforts towards securing our enterprise architecture or all of it. Same with the adage about running away, two guys running away from a lion, right? You don't need to outrun the lion, you just need to outrun your friend. I think the same can be said for this. If you're taking more steps than some of the easier targets around you, then that is going to provide you a level of security in its own, because attackers are just going to be going for the easiest way into an organization.
Yeah, I think you're right. But we do see, I guess, some of the more consistently applied things like segmentation. It tends to be most of the organizations we'll go into now won't be operating flat networks. They'll have thought of how they're segmenting different systems away from others. I guess you could say that a lot of organizations are getting that part consistently right now, thinking about how they're structuring their networks to ensure that obviously the crown jewels are not being put towards the edge of or the perimeter of their environments. So there are some things I think that people do consistently well. I think on the process side of it, there's certainly lots more in the cloud space now through automation, being able to have kind of regular visibility of these things. So I guess you could say that some of that consistency is brought through those types of platforms that will go and automate a lot of these actions and help to make sure that you're keeping on top of regular activities. Hugh mentioned patching earlier as well. So I think there are aspects of consistency where people are doing this well. I think resource constraints is not unique to your organization. Lots of organizations suffer with trying to get a balance between what value focusing time and effort into this space brings, compared to that overall reduction. I think the thing I find, Hugh, and I don't know about you, it's actually really difficult to measure the effectiveness of a security architecture. Obviously, you pointed out a few things earlier that obviously in your experience, organizations are using to see whether they're achieving an overall reduction in some of these areas, but that would directly equate to an overall increase in the security of the environment. But measuring how effective a good solid security architecture is quite difficult, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, security is always a cost, right? Security is never a revenue generating function, and it's hard to work out how much you would have had to spend had you not taken these measures to secure yourself. So yeah, the metrics that we can use aren't perfect, but I think they're enough of a good indicator for us to pay attention to them.
I think interestingly as well, sometimes organizations see security as an insurance policy, which you only really recognize the value of the steps you take through securing your infrastructure when you've had an incident or you've had a breach, and you're looking backwards. Actually working with specialists, like Hugh and the wider team, actually understanding how those controls have worked to prevent an attacker from getting any further. I guess we see that through some of the red team engagements, don't we, Hugh, in terms of the controls that frustrate attackers, that work, some of the newer technologies that work together to bring together a very concise kind of view of the world, so that attackers don't really get as much information as they used to. I think looking at that side of it is interesting. I think the other area that I'm interested in, though, Hugh, is what weaknesses in this structure would an attacker look for? What do you look for in a security architecture? How do you approach this?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, it's the things like these configuration weaknesses. It's systems that have been rushed together, deployed quickly, where the time just isn't there to fully connect everything together properly. That's one of the biggest issues at the moment.
So we're back to this kind of mentality of prevention is better than cure. So, looking very much at the planning side of it rather than the reactive side of it, to make sure we understand what we're protecting, how we're protecting it, and, really understanding how those controls are working together to obviously secure the environment. We just had another question around how the individual can develop their architecture to remain effective. I think we've probably answered some of that already in keeping up the basics. Security architecture doesn't have to be complicated, does it? I think keeping good visibility of your risk profile, keeping good visibility of the landscape and the threats, but again, operating the processes, the things that make changes to that. I mean, how often, Hugh, do you find misconfiguration of things that maybe haven't been through as robust change process as they could have been? You were indicating a minute ago, you're looking for weaknesses. So I think, keeping processes, up to scratch and making sure we're getting the right approvals, probably the softer side of this, because, as we all know in security, not everything is solved by technology. So I guess, to help remain effective, I guess it's doing the basics right and doing those consistently, Hugh.
Yeah, I'd say that is bang on. I think change management processes are one to really nail down, because, a lot of the time we'll see someone saying, oh, this is just a small change, it needs to be done, pressure from above, get the change done. But across the whole enterprise, that sort of tiny bit of risk that we're introducing through that unmanaged change then aggregates across the enterprise. And soon we've got, quite a lot of actual aggregated risk that no one's really aware exists because it's not documented. So, technology is all well and good, but nailing that people and process, yeah, that's really important.
Yeah, thanks, Hugh. So I just want to go back to the poll question. So we asked, how will attacks change as a result of the new Office macro secure by default settings? And we had 4 answers. Things around tricking users into disabling default protection, phishing via other built-in apps or other means of getting into the organization, other vulnerabilities, or just kind of carry on as they are because organizations, disable these things by default. I think it's really interesting, nobody picked the last one. I think through my experience, I would probably agree with that as well. I see a lot of macro enabled files still, being transferred around organizations. A few people have answered around tricking users into disabling the default protection. Again, I think some of the social engineering side of this, Hugh, that's potentially a viable option. I think most people pick the middle two, right? They picked phishing. I think phishing is rife all of the time. It's a nice, easy entry point for attackers, particularly for business-focused, public-facing users such as marketing teams, sales teams, HR teams, where they're interacting a lot with external parties. But again, trying to find other vulnerabilities to gain access, that again was quite a popular answer, and it comes back to something you said earlier, Hugh. If you go down the rabbit hole so far, and you get stuck, ultimately you're going to come back and look for another route in. If you come up against a control that it's going to take too long for you to work out how to break it, you're probably just going to go and look for another route. So again, I think that's a very good answer, and it's interesting in how we kind of respond to those. I mean, trying to find other vulnerabilities to gain access, obviously defending against that. Hugh's given you some ideas about how to kind of take a threat-centric kind of focus when looking at your security architecture, layering security controls to make sure that those are working together to achieve a common goal, but are not too similar that they can be broken with common attacks. Again, thinking about phishing, via other built-in apps, there are obviously lots of things that we use in business now that are collaborative with both internal and external stakeholders. So, it is, possible that, looking at other built-in apps might be a good kind of route. But, Microsoft, again, have got their own kind of security model in how they look to block these things. So, there is, again, talk recently, Hugh, wasn't there, around disabling kind of communication with public email addresses via Office apps like Teams. Interestingly, doesn't come as an option out the box that's defaulted to off. A lot of organizations recently have been sort of turning that off because they've identified no need to talk to Hotmail, Gmail, various other accounts from a business Teams instance. So I think, again, phishing via those types of methods is a viable option. So interesting thoughts there. Thank you for those. Hopefully, some of what we've been talking about today will help to put into perspective how you might think about those types of things, although that is obviously one isolated idea there. But Hugh, anything else I guess you want to add at this point around enterprise architectures, either how they work to sort of help organizations to secure their environments, or have a threat-centric process so that they can focus on the things that are most important, measuring the effectiveness of them, or indeed, looking at some of the weaknesses as well?
I think we've covered quite a lot of really good stuff there. I just seen a question come in there about our comments around security being a cost, and yeah, I do think that absolutely it can be repositioned as a great advertisement for an organization if you can hold up your testing attestations on the wall, say to potential customers, look, we're doing this and this, we really are ahead of the game, we're going to be keeping the data that you give us safe. Absolutely, it can drive revenue. I think not many people see it that way, and it is really, I think, across the board still seen as just a cost.
Yeah, I think it depends on who you talk to as well. I mean, if you're looking to talk to executive stakeholders, often, a lot of the things that they're investing in have a return on investment. They have a direct ability to show the benefit. I think the comments we were making was that security doesn't often drive those until you can see the benefit of the controls you've put in place from incidents or from breaches. So, by no means, would I want to advocate that security is a waste of time and is just dead cost, because that's very much what we go in to talk to our clients about. But I think depending on who you talk to, the benefits of security and how you balance those and message those is incredibly important. So I do agree with that point, and I think as we move forwards as a security, being more aware of security and the threats to our environments, I think selling that message internally will hopefully become easier. Nobody wants to become the next big ticket item where you're the talking point of a major breach, and all of these things that you're doing to proactively protect yourselves through this information security ecosystem are ultimately going to be preventing security from being a sunk cost or looking at it as an insurance policy. So I think the point was made more so to highlight the fact that working proactively and looking at how you secure these environments before you get breached is obviously far more beneficial than relying on the security that you put in place post-incident or post-breach. And hopefully with those two things working together, you can see that the investment is made in a very positive and very proactive manner. But it's a good comment, and equally, I'm quite happy to be corrected on areas like that. Have we got any other questions? Great. Okay. Well, Hugh, thank you for your time. Thank you to everybody for attending. And hopefully we'll see you again at one of our future briefings. Take care and have a good afternoon.